Hello and welcome everyone to Beyond Compliance. My name is Jim Albright, and this is the place for you to hear all about what influences, challenges, impacts, and solutions that are facing process manufacturing today. Now, for those of you who might be new to this series, Beyond Compliance was created many, many years ago as a regular update for QA, safety, operations, and business leaders to learn new ways of thinking about the methods and tools and the processes that you use to consistently and efficiently deliver quality products to your customers. Now, one of the highlights that you get from being here is that you get the chance to take part in the conversation by asking questions to our industry experts who not only have seen many of the issues that we explore on the show, but they have successfully solved for them. So it's really cool. You get to be part of this discussion today. But in case you missed it, the series is hosted by Safety Chain, whose mission in life is to unite plant production, quality, and compliance together through a single digital plant management platform that's used in thousands of manufacturing facilities across the globe to improve yield, maximize productivity, and ensure compliance. It is pretty cool. Now, before we get started, I just need to let you know that we've muted all attending microphones, but of course, please submit your questions into the webinar panel anytime during the session, and we'll do our best to get through them all by the end where we have our Q&A. We've scheduled about an hour for the session, but if we do run out of time and your question didn't get addressed, don't worry, we absolutely will follow up with you later. Your question will get answered. It's important to us. We will absolutely get back to you. And then finally, the session is being recorded. So all of you today will be getting an email from us with the recording and links to the slides. So we're glad you're here. Also, I'm glad to welcome back to Beyond Compliance Michael Parent, who is the principal at Michael Parent Consulting. He's also a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt and the author of the book, The Lean Innovation Cycle. Now, some of you may know Michael already, but in case you missed it, he's recently chatted with us on the best ways to approach SPC, as well as ways to better identify and address the 8 primary wastes within manufacturing. Those 2 sessions were absolutely amazing. So, Michael, I love your unique approach to explaining some of these potentially misunderstood but essential processes. So I'm really excited to learn what your perspectives are and, basically tell us all about how these lean processes are falling down and what can be done to fix that. So why don't we start off a little bit about your background and then you take us through this journey today.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. As you said, the last 2 presentations are really hopefully a blend of some information and trying to have a whole lot of fun. So all these presentations, we want to be engaging and give you a lot of examples. And today I'll show you some successes and I'll show you some failures of things that I've encountered in my career. So just to get started, kind of the academic background that's on the screen is I reside here in the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan. I have an MBA from the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I've got my Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt from Lawrence Tech, which is another university in the Detroit area. And as Jim mentioned, I wrote a book in 2022. It's all about how you take this framework of lean and how you take this really cool emerging framework of human-centered design and how they can actually augment each other and come together to work and kind of have a greater benefit for your organization. So I did that mostly as just a pet project, some research that turned into a book. So as what he talked about today, Jim talked about today, is we want to talk about the foundations of lean and why lean fails within organizations. So we'll start with talking about what makes lean successful. I'll show you the counterfactual of that, what makes lean unsuccessful. And then we'll turn to the house of lean, which is kind of the framework that Toyota developed to say, this is what lean is all about. And we're gonna follow that roadmap, that blueprint that they've developed for us, and we'll really start to understand why we need this really good foundation before we get into some of the other higher octane improvements that we see in lean. And then lastly, we want to talk about creating a Kaizen culture or a culture of continuous improvement rather than just doing these one-off projects that often happen with lean. So that's kind of what we have for the agenda. We'll start real quickly with what I call the anatomy of lean. This is a little diagram that I've developed, but really what it gets at is that lean is a cultural mindset. The most important part of this diagram is this right here. Lean is an ongoing operational philosophy. It's not like Six Sigma where you run a Six Sigma project or you run some sort of project that has a terminal end date to it. To be lean is to be lean, right? You've got to run in it and you've got to act like you're lean day in and day out. Because of this, what we tend to do is we tend to have more business principles and concepts that ultimately deliver value rather than using kind of these high octane statistical tools and these other kind of flashy things that you might have in the Six Sigma toolbox. We also say in lean that no opportunity is too small. So when we talk about lean, I always use the metaphor that we're a mile wide and we're an inch deep. We're not going very deep in understanding a lot, but we're just removing waste from the process. We're trying to add value to the customer every chance we get and remove anything that doesn't add value. So when we talk about this, we want to do that everywhere. And the wider our ditch is, the more opportunities we'll have for improvement. Because in all of this stuff, like I said, we're not using high octane stuff. We're not going to get a mile down and really understand some really really technical or acute issues that we have in our organization. Rather, we're just going to continually try to improve little by little, day by day. So what that means for us is we'll start with a Toyota benchmark on how they do it. So Toyota developed lean. It's called the Toyota production system, and it's kind of turned into this thing called lean. So I'll give you an example. Every employee in Toyota is required to submit 100 ideas for improvement every year. We call those Kaizens. Just in the US, Toyota has 10 facilities and 136,000 line employees. So with a little bit of tricky multiplication, we can figure out that Toyota is going to be getting 13.6 million concrete ideas for improvement every single year. And oh, by the way, they produce a car every 7 seconds. So what this means is that what they do is part of their DNA, is part of who they are, is they're continually seeking opportunities to improve, and they're coming up with new ideas while still continuing their operation that is at a performance level that we can't even dream of. So you might say, wow, this 13.6 million ideas, are they all good ideas? Probably not. Maybe 1% of them are. I would still take 136,000 good ideas a year. I would take 0.1%. I'd take 100 good ideas a year. And the idea is that it's so ingrained in their DNA that it's almost impossible for them not to be improving. It's impossible for them not to continually improve and have a newer level of performance than they did in the previous year. So that, I would say, is a success. Now, let me show you one of my projects. This is not a great sales technique, but this is one of my projects. And essentially, we were running a lean project. And I was working in a recruiting organization. So they were trying to decrease the time it takes. This is called time to fill an open space, requisition, we might call it. So what I have here is their time to fill by month. And then this pink diamond line is the number of countermeasures that we were doing each month throughout our project. And what we see is that as we were working on the project, we had some pretty good results. We had a month-over-month decrease of 10% as we were doing the project. And we had our demonstrated best month ever as the project came to a close. Then what happened? We stopped doing the project. We took our eyes off of the prize. And as we stopped doing countermeasures, we backslid and we backslid and we backslid. And by February 2020, we had our demonstrated worst performance. And by the way, March and April 2020 did not make things easier for us, as we all know what happened there. So this really shows you, and I'm happy to say it, this was a failure, right? Is we had really good improvements. We showed that we are capable of making improvements, but if we don't sustain those and if we don't have stability in our organization to continually improve month over month indefinitely, it's really all for naught. So let's talk about the differences in those things. I have this, I don't know what you want to call it. Time is on the x-axis, performance is on the y-axis. And we've kind of got this nature of improvement. And there's two aspects to it. One is this kind of decreasing variation, continually improving small incremental steps. And we call this, we're trying to develop a smooth operation. I'm trying to have stability within my organization through the use of standards and the use of some of these lean principles. And then we have these big stepwise impacts that come from lean projects, Kaizen blitzes, these sorts of things that are more acute and they're targeted at specific areas. Now, both of those are real aspects of lean. They're both real advantages of using lean. But the catch-22 of this is that without doing the small, non-sexy stuff, hey, I'm going to build standards and I'm going to have good visual management and this sort of thing, these specific projects, as I hopefully just showed you in my last one, they don't have the staying power. They don't have the sustainability to continue to perform because we're not living in an environment that has stability, that is really bracketed, or it gives us boundaries with good standards and visual management. So what we're going to be all about is really building an environment that allows us to have this so that later on we can have this, right? So I've got a couple takeaways through this presentation. We'll summarize them all at the end. But this first one is that really stepwise improvements are not sustainable unless we already have stability, if we're already living lean in the organization. A lot of people will say, well, lean fails. Well, it depends on how you do it. If you just focus on doing these projects and they're one-off projects and you're doing Kaizen blitzes here and special things over here, of course it's going to fail because you're not living into the ethos of what lean is all about. Now, this is the house of lean. This is the blueprint that the Toyota production system is based on. This is my drawing. If you go online, you'll see all kinds of other drawings. And what I like about this is that it just says tools, and it's not a whole list of all the tools. Now, what we want to focus on is this foundation. People want continuous improvement. They want respect for people, but they want to do it in kind of this ditch effort. Hey, we're facing expense pressures. The title of this presentation is In an Uncertain Economy. We want to do something to fix something, right? Well, you can't, it really doesn't work that way. Instead, what we need to do first, even before respect for people, even before continuous improvement, is we have to create an environment that's stable, that we can empower our people to make the impact in our organization that we want them to make. So it starts here, believe it or not, with good visual management and standard work. So that's what we're going to be focusing on a lot throughout this webinar. Now, I know that there was already a question that came in, and it was asking about how do we determine what foundational lean pillars we should focus on. Well, it depends on where you are in the journey of lean. If you already have good visual management and standard work, continue to work through the tools and engaging your people, always trying to focus on delivering customer value. That's our goal. That's the top of the house. But if you're just starting out, let's definitely make sure that we have these good foundational principles to begin with. Okay, let's start with visual management. So what's visual management? Visual management is about setting an architecture of control points that help us make decisions quickly and orient us to our surroundings. It helps us differentiate between what's important and what's not, and we already do this in our daily lives. So I'll give you an example. I play the guitar, I play some gigs out in some bars, and at the end of the night, how do I know which chords are mine and which chords are someone else's without getting into a bar fight? Well, I wrap all of my cables with red tape, and now it's very easy to identify which cables are mine and which ones aren't. It's visual management. It's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward, and it's something that you can do in your life every day. Now, if you've ever studied for a test or been to college, you may have used a highlighter. And as you were opening up your book and highlighting your book, you probably thought, I'm creating an architecture of control points that allow me to make visual decisions and make it easier to make decisions, right? You're talking all about that. No, you were probably just saying, I'm going to highlight this because it's going to be a lot easier to come back to the words that I already know are important and I've already reviewed them. So that's what you're doing. You're creating this visual architecture that makes it quicker to make decisions based on the control points that you've done, but we just call it highlighting. But that's what we're doing in visual management. And most of you who live with a spouse or significant other or somebody else, I would almost guarantee have a different color toothbrush. And we all know why, right? It's because we're creating a visual architecture of control points that make us or help us make decisions quicker and easier. It's exactly what we're doing. We're not thinking about that. We're not calling it that, but we're saying, gosh, at early in the morning, I don't want to make that mistake. I don't want to brush my teeth with someone else's toothbrush. So again, it's just simple visual management. This is the stuff that we should be using throughout our daily lives. Well, we do use it in our daily lives, so we should be using it in our business lives as well. Now, we encounter this all the time. When you went to kindergarten, you were taught to raise your hand, and the teacher had that in place because it was an architecture of visual control points to help her make a better decision on how to manage the class and who had a question. We do this when we put letters in the mail, we put the little red flag up. And what's really important is that when we drive, when we're on the road, we have visual management everywhere. Visual management is prevalent in our lives in areas where decision making is absolutely critical. If you think about on the road, right, it's a life and death scenario every time. You've got stoplights, you've got stop signs, you've got turn signals, you've got headlights, you've got different types of painting on the road. All of these things are acting as visual management. They're providing an architecture to help you judge how not to get into an accident, right? That's this whole thing. We're doing it in our daily lives. We need to bring it into our organizations to make our employees feel more empowered and feel like they have an architecture where they can make decisions a lot better. We also, visual management is not just about these control points, but it's about what I call creating a winnable game. So if you go to a high school game, any kind of sporting event, you're going to see a scoreboard, and this scoreboard is going to tell you a number of things. It's going to tell you whether or not your team is winning or losing, but it's going to tell you a whole bunch of other things that for business nomenclature, we could call key performance indicators, right? It's going to tell you the context by which you're playing the game. And that is ultimately going to define your strategy. If you're losing in the first quarter of a football game, that's a very different strategy that you're going to have than if you're losing in the last 30 seconds, right? Visual management helps the entire team see where they're at and how, very importantly, the players have to know how their activities relate to the objective. If they don't know how their efforts relate to the objective of winning the game, then you've really lost them. And that's something that you need to bring into the fold and make sure that they understand. Visual management of really showing them the numbers, the context by which they're playing the game is absolutely key and important. So at a high level, that's visual management. There's some other things we talk about in Lean sometimes. 5S is another huge kind of maybe 10,000 foot view of visual management when we get a little bit more into some of the tools of it. But we'll say visual management's important and move on. The next foundation is standard work in that house of Lean. Now, standard work is really a way of defining what the best practice is. You can see here Oprah just absolutely enthused about standard work today. We need to know how long the process should take. We need to know, the time and sequencing of this event, and we really need to know what our current best practices are. It's very helpful when it comes to maintaining what's already been improved, as we kind of talked about with my failed project, as well as training new people as they come into the organization, right? If we don't have good working standards, and most manufacturing plants do have some working standards, right? But if we don't have good ones, and if we're not constantly updating them and reviewing them, we really don't have any boundaries, any mechanisms to prevent us from backsliding and lowering our performance. Now, this is kind of a famous diagram within the Lean Six Sigma community, but I think it's famous because everyone likes it, right? Again, we've got time and performance, call it improvement, call it performance up here. And we see that we're rolling this ball up the hill. And in order for the ball not to backslide, we have to put standards in place that say we've moved it up here, and now I'm going to standardize this level of performance. Talk a little bit more about that. Takeaway number 3, standards create stability. Again, that's the name of the game here, is we're creating a foundation. Foundations are all about stability. And that allows us to improve over time because it allows us not to backslide. And of course, you look at my project and you say, well, that's what went wrong, right? Is they didn't have that stability. They didn't, but it wasn't just that we didn't have standards in place. We didn't have the culture of standards in place. This project was actually more about demonstrating that lean actually does work. So that's why they were really gung-ho about getting into it without actually creating the culture to begin with. Now, the benefits of standard work kind of work like this, right? It's easy to identify and countermeasure deviations from standards. It's easy to identify gaps in standards. It's helpful to train new employees as they come into the organization. And as new best practices are developed, because everybody's operating on a similar standard, it has a much greater scope, a much greater impact as that standard is updated and it translates through the entire organization. I've worked with organizations that have, they've acquired different regional groups across the US and they've got different standards across the geographies. Well, now if you improve in one area, it's the improvements compartmentalized to that area because not everybody is working in the same way. So that best practice might not actually roll out to the entire organization. But by having standards across the entire organization, any improvement is going to have a much greater scope and a much greater impact on the organization. Now, I like this little flow chart over here because it's kind of a fun little way to improve. So let's say something happened. A defect was produced, a long cycle time, you don't have enough capacity, whatever it is. Well, you can ask yourself, why did it happen? And you can ask it in the way of, was the standard followed? Now, let's say in the event that it was followed and you still had a defect. Well, that means that your standard is deficient in some way. There's a gap between what you're trying to do and the standard that's trying to tell you how to do it. So very simple, you would simply revise the standard to improve. Also, if you don't have a standard to begin with, and a defect was produced, you would say, well, there's a gap in the standard. The standard doesn't exist. I'm going to create one or revise and improve an existing operating procedure. Now, what happens if the standard was not followed? You had the standard. Somebody said, you know what, that standard's for everyone else, but I'm going to do it my way. Well, you've got a decision to make, right? The standard was not followed, but it was not followed for a particular reason. And it was probably that the standard was hard to adhere to in some way. That's mostly people are finding the path of least resistance. And if they're not following a standard, they're not doing it out of malice or sabotage. They're doing it because there's an easier way out there. So rather than, a lot of people say, well, the standard wasn't followed, we need to retrain these people on the standard. They probably already know what it is, they just didn't follow it. So instead, before we get to retraining somebody to the standard, we need to take a look at our process and talk about airproofing. So airproofing is really important because it helps us prevent mistakes from happening. It helps us from deviating from the standard. This is another thing I've kind of come up with myself. It is a countermeasure spectrum. Over here, we have the individual. And over here, we have the process, right? So as countermeasures fall on the spectrum, the more that the countermeasure is intertwined with the process, the system, the actual doing of work, the better the countermeasure is, and the more you're going to be able to adhere to that as a standard way to do work. Conversely, if you focus on retraining that individual and giving them a 1-point lesson or a written standard or a visual standard, they still have a lot of agency to deviate from the standard. So that's kind of another takeaway here, is that retrain the operator is the worst countermeasure we can muster. Now, it's still a countermeasure, it's still good, it's still an improvement, and I'd rather have that over not having that. But we need to think critically, because a lot of times as we come up with, man, there was a defect, this cycle time was too long, we say, oh, well, the countermeasures, we have to retrain this person to do it better. And that's not wrong, but there's the more correct answer on the board, right? So let me show you what I mean. We all know that we're supposed to stop at stop signs. I don't know about you, but I try to blow past these every chance I get, right? They're just slowing me down. And in the meantime, I'm not stopping if I don't have to. And we would call this in the countermeasure spectrum, we would call this a warning, right? Now, past the warning, we might have something like downstream inspection, where a police cruiser is sitting right in front of a stop sign, or they might be sitting away from the stop sign or something like that. But I think we would all agree that we stop more frequently when we know that a cop is watching us, right? Because we know that there's a consequence to that action or that non-action. So we would say that this is a better countermeasure than just putting in a stop sign to have us stop um, at a particular intersection on the road. But just as correct as it is to say that this is a better adherence to standard, we do know that those cops do stop people or do ticket people for not stopping at stop signs. And instead, if we had something like airproofing, where we had a toll gate or we had spike strips, we know that that is more or less very high on this airproofing process-oriented countermeasure. And as such, there is going to be way more adherence to the standard of not going through this particular area unless you're adhering to the standard. In this case, maybe you're paying a fee or you're going the correct way or something like that. Now, mistake proofing does not have to require tons of software or hardware or something like that. And in fact, basic geometry gets you there quite frequently. As you see here, here's all the computer ports that you have. And unless you're my grandma and try really hard, you probably can't get a USB port in an Ethernet port, right? Or a USB drive in an Ethernet port. But in most instances, you know that your little adapter goes into one of these ports and it can't go into any of the other ones because of this unique geometry that it has. That's airproofing. That's perfect, and it doesn't cost you anything. It's just how you make the shape of things. Now, likewise, if you go to a health club, they might have a sign that says, "Do not put your bags on the lockers." I love this sign because invariably, when you see those signs, you will see bags on lockers. Instead, what some people have done is they've gotten a triangle, a wedge, and that has airproofed people from adhering to that standard. You can't put a bag on there, it's going to slide off. So you don't need those signs, you don't need those warnings, which are lower on the countermeasure spectrum. But with just a little bit of geometry, you have solved your problem and you've put this airproofing further into the process itself, right? It doesn't rely on human agency to adhere to those warnings. Now, what happens when we put these two foundations together of visual management and standard work? We see that they augment each other. I'll give you an example. The first job I worked at was a little place called Wendy's. And I didn't know it at the time, but Wendy's was lean out of their minds, and most fast food restaurants are lean out of their minds. I'll give you Wendy's by the numbers. 40% of their employees are between the ages of 18 to 20 years old, which means it's probably their first job, right? The average tenure of a Wendy's employee is 2.7 years. So they've got rampant turnover, right? And yet somehow they've been able to muster a cool $2 billion in the year 2022. How did they do it? How did they get a bunch of people who have never worked a day in their lives to produce for them $2 billion? Well, a big part of it was that they used visual management and standard work. And as you can see here, this is their standard work on how to assemble all of their sandwiches. You can see it combines elements of visual management and it combines standard work. And between these two principles, you see that they've created good standards. It's easy to train new employees. It reduced defects on the production of sandwiches. And of course, it's easy to audit. It's easy to figure out whether or not that sandwich is adhering to the standard that every customer expects, no matter what Wendy's they go to. So we see here that this is the Wendy's fast food assembly area too. And we can see that it's used a couple other areas of of visual management and standard work. A lot of the stuff that we discuss in 5S is incorporated in here. Where we can expect to the left, we've got the buns and the meat patties, and they've got different elements of good work design, right? Where the standard work is that the cheese goes on before the veggies, the bacon goes on before the veggies, but after the cheese. And as you can see here, by developing their actual workstation to adhere to the working standards, they've reduced lots of errors or opportunities for errors, and they've standardized the production of their sandwiches. Now, all this is well and good, but what we want to do is, that's just kind of the beginning. That's the foundation, as we said, creating the foundation of lean for your organization. But we also want to engage now, once we have that stability, we want to create a culture that has respect for people, that empowers people to essentially make decisions and find opportunities for improvement. Because that, as you recall from that kind of weird looking chart that had the decrease of variation, right? The more we can get these types of things where people are looking at their own operations and making small little improvements, the more we're going to get kind of that gradual continual improvement and more opportunities. But also it's going to create an ethos, a culture that allows for those more acute opportunities to have the stepwise increases that we really want. So what we've done so far with visual management and standard work is we've created operational stability. And that's really important because now people are going to be able to see the opportunities in their organization. Without good visual management, without standard work, it's very, very difficult to see where the opportunities actually are. Okay, so if we return to our fun benchmark example at Toyota, we see that what they're doing. How are they doing this, right? How are they getting 3.6 million concrete ideas every year? Well, they've done it by having good operational stability, where they have standard work. They don't have to think about where things are or what they're doing. And they've also trained their employees to have the acumen to identify opportunities when they occur. We call this identifying waste. So takeaway number 5 here is simply to train the employees to see waste. We've created an environment where they feel comfortable and empowered. Now we have, or they feel comfortable, and now we have to empower them to be able to identify opportunities to improve. I like to do this in 2 ways. The first one is looking at process mapping and giving them an understanding of that their process is really a system of interconnected processes, right? None of this is happening in a vacuum, and that really by decreasing variation in their process, you're going to get greater stability, you're going to have continual improvement, and you're going to constantly move that needle forward. And then, of course, every time you move it forward, you go back, you look at the standard, you implement the standard to the new best practice, and you continually improve. So just at a high level, I like to go through this thing called a SIPOC. It stands for suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. And it's just a good way to get the workers to understand where they're getting their materials from, what those materials are, how they're transforming, how they're conferring value to turn these inputs in their process into an output, and why their customer cares about that output. You can do this for any operation. You can do it for the whole business. You can do it for a production department. You can do it for a particular line on that production department. But it's really good, and it's really eye-opening when people are actually engaged in this way, and they might not really intuitively understand this until it's laid out for them as well. Now, the other way to really help them see opportunities to improve is to teach them the 8 wastes. And Jim already mentioned we have a presentation on the 8 wastes. I think it's one of the most foundational parts of lean. I think it's really fun. A quick anagram for waste is downtime. Obviously, waste creates downtime. It stands for defects, overproduction, waiting, non-utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, and extra processing. These 8 together are really what we're trying to remove from the operation. Now, what I like to do is I like to have little sticky tabs as I'm talking about people, or as I'm talking to people and explaining to them the different wastes and their process map, and they've done a SIPOC. I'll have them take their sticky notes and put it on a process map to say, I've identified waste here, and this is an opportunity to improve. With a simple whiteboard and some sticky notes and a Sharpie or a dry erase marker, you can draw this at their workstations, and every time as something occurs to them, a defect, they're waiting on something, they can just signal that that's what happened at that step, and that provides an opportunity to reflect and hopefully improve upon that. It's a really high leverage improvement way of doing things, right? Because it doesn't cost any money, and you're coming up with all these new ideas. Not saying you can act on all of them, but you're going to be generating these things more and more. As I mentioned, we're an inch deep, we're a mile wide. If I can make that ditch a mile and a half wide, 2 miles wide, that's where the value is coming through lean. It's not coming by digging the ditch any deeper. It's not going to happen with the tools that we have available. It's going to happen by identifying more opportunities to improve and capitalizing on those opportunities. So, as I mentioned, you might have these ideas, you don't know exactly how to act upon them. One of the things that we can try is this thing called PDCA. It stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act, and it's a structured way to try out things while also limiting the risk of doing mistakes. We don't have to be afraid of making mistakes. There's a book that I love, it's called Little Bets, and it's all about how different people use prototyping and kind of all this stuff to really just mitigate the risks of doing something differently. They call it failing fast to learn quickly. That's the whole idea of PDCA. If I can make failures, if I can mitigate the risks of trying something new and it doesn't work out 9 times out of 10, but those risks are mitigated, and then that 10th time, it really does have a big impact, or it does improve my operation. Well, now I've got that for the rest of the time of the facility, and that's worth it in the end. So PDCA really helps us. It hedges our bets and allows us to learn quickly and improve quickly without a lot of risk associated with it. So takeaway number 6, promote the ethos of lean and mitigate the risks of trying new things with PDCA. Let me show you how it works. Plan, I want to test something and I want to know how I want to test it. So let's say I produced a defect and I think going with a different supplier is going to decrease that defect. Okay, that's my test. I'm going to get a different supplier. That's my do. I'm going to make those changes, and then I'm going to check. I'm going to see at the end of the month if with that new supplier material I've actually had more decrease, or I've actually decreased my defects. If I have, that's great. I'm going to make that the new standard. I'm going to buy material from that supplier, and I'm not going to buy material from the other supplier. That's my act. If it didn't work, I'm not going to change anything. I'm going to go back and say, it didn't work, but we learned. We live and learn. So, and that's the whole idea here, is that it operates as a circle. It comes back, and we try something else, and we continually improve in this way of learning quickly, failing quickly, and learning as much as possible in a short amount of time. Now, if you ever have an issue of remembering that it's Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA, I brought along Arthur Fonzarelli to help us out. So the Fonz, as we know, loves PDCA. So lastly, in our quest for creating a culture of continual improvement, is we have to create a mechanism to get the ideas from our line workers. The line workers are the process experts. They're the ones that are identifying waste. They're the ones that are living with the defects. They are the ones that know already how they want to improve the game. All we have to do is call on them when they raise their hand. So we have to teach them to raise their hand as well. Creating something as simple as a suggestion box gives employees the empowerment, or empowers them to submit ideas for improvement. But the catch-22 of this is that we got to do something about it. We can't just have a suggestion box and then we never follow up with them and we never talk to them and they don't know why their idea wasn't improved and they get discouraged and they never submit an idea again. Instead, by having a good mechanism to adhere or to go to the Kaizen ideas and field them, and then make a decision on whether it's something we want to try or not, and then follow up with them on why we did or did not try something is really, really helpful. Lastly, we want to reward the behaviors that we want to see. So we want to promote this sort of thing. We need to recognize the people who are coming up with ideas, who are participating in this sort of lean operating philosophy. And that actually gets us to one of the last slides here about our Toyota benchmark. It's not just enough that they have stability throughout their organization. It's not just enough that they're trained and able to identify waste, but they also have a standard themselves for submitting ideas. They have a standard, the management team does, for reviewing these ideas, a standard for implementing them and trying new things, and then a standard for communicating these new things and trying them out. This is the only way something like Toyota works. You won't get this. If any piece of this is missing, forget about it. So very important to create an ethos of lean. We really have to have stability to begin with that allows them to easily identify waste. We have to train them to identify waste, and then we have to have a standard really to field the suggestions and the ideas as they come in. So takeaway 7, create a culture that promotes new ideas by giving feedback. Always give feedback. And then this is kind of the summary of all of the 7 takeaways that we've discussed here in the past 40 some minutes. So as I said, stepwise improvements are not sustainable unless stability already exists. Remember my project that did not work, the time to fill, we backslid because we didn't have stability in our organization already. Create a winnable game. We have to be able to show employees how their efforts translate to the results. They don't want to go and get tackled on the football field unless they feel like that effort is going to help them win the game, right? That's kind of how it feels. Number 3, standards create stability and allow us to improve over time. That's that model with the backsliding, with the big balls that we're rolling up the hill. We got to put the wedge in there so we don't backslide. Retrain the operator is the worst countermeasure you can muster. Remember, that's our countermeasure spectrum. It's better to have a toll booth than to have a stop sign. That's the idea there. Number 5, train employees to see waste. We've got to empower our employees. We've got to give them the acumen to know what they're looking for. We want to promote the ethos and mitigate risks by trying new things with PDCA. We just discussed that. That mitigates our risks. It hedges our bets, and it allows us to fail quickly and make improvements, definitive improvements. And then lastly, create a culture that promotes new ideas and gives feedback. So we want to get the new ideas coming in through suggestions or Kaizen suggestions, suggestion box, however you want to do it, but we have to have a way to provide them feedback as well. So that is, in a nutshell, my presentations. Jim, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
Of course. Michael, thank you so much. A lot of the questions that are coming in are kind of aligning around, we'll just say like the broader spectrum of, I would call it culture. So you've touched on this in many different ways, but basically when adopting this company organizational wide lean culture, easier said than done, right? Do you think it's kind of partly due to that first one here, that everybody's kind of focused on those stepwise improvements instead of the, as you call them, unsexy, more process driven, smooth operation type standards?
Yeah, I think there's obviously it's the shiny object syndrome. Is the stuff that looks cool and is sexy is the stuff that we want to do.
And then,
If somebody said, hey, I can solve your business problems, and all it takes is it takes a lot of hard work, obviously that doesn't sell quite as well as, hey, we've got this toolkit and it's the silver bullet. So that is oftentimes what we see. I think having a good lean champion within the organization that knows exactly, really understands lean and understands it as an operating philosophy, and disambiguating that from some lean processes, or excuse me, from lean projects and initiatives, goes a long way. And I would also say I don't think lean is too successful as a grassroots project. Just it really requires a lean champion that understands lean as an operating philosophy. And they have to understand that it is a little bit of a slog. And if you have fortitude, we see time and time again that it really pays dividends. And that lastly, lean is not a grassroots effort. You want to have a champion that can support you to get you through some of those times where it might not be the easiest thing to do, but it's going to pay dividends culturally in the long run.
Yes. Let's talk about KPIs. Your scoreboard example there. Is it a challenge, would you say, for folks in manufacturing to really get a handle on the broader KPIs, right? So you have your line KPIs, and then you have your overall production KPIs, and then you have your business KPIs, and everything needs to tie together. Do you think that's a kind of common pitfall?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really have a lot of performance incentives that don't ultimately match. One is production, right? How many manufacturing plants KPI number one is production, right? It should be. It makes sense that it should be, except when it comes at the expense of everything else, right? Of delivery, of quality, of all these things. So having a good balance of that is a struggle, and it's a conversation that you really need to have at kind of that cross section of manufacturing operations manager and the director and vice president, because once a KPI becomes the target, it ceases to be a good KPI. So I would say production targets are terrible KPIs. They're not going to
Mm,
tell you whether or not you're winning or losing the game. Um, but obviously, production makes you money. So there's a financial component here, and it's really having the balanced scorecard of understanding the quality aspects, the safety aspects, of course, it should be number one, and then kind of the production and that sort of thing as well.
right. Now let's talk about asking the question, was the standard followed? It sounds simple, but the fact that it's one of your key takeaways tells me at least that this is a common struggle because we're moving so fast. We don't take the time to ask that question. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the number one question to ask when you're trying to do this continual, what we call standards-based improvement. I think it gets very difficult because people don't want to face the fact that they don't have good standards. And well, of course we have good standards. And then when you ask the question, was the standard followed? You almost invariably will get kind of this gap in the standard. Yes, it was followed, but we didn't really have clear standards to begin with, and that's the issue. You've got to have
Right.
rigid standards. You should have a time component associated with it. You should have a methodology, step by step, sequence by sequence. So I think when we ask that question, I see far more often the gap in standard is the path that we go, far more than somebody was not adhering to the standard that they understood. Again, it's an operational philosophy thing. It's a cultural thing, because invariably, as soon as you say that, people will say, well, you're not. You're just telling them what their expectations are. And that becomes a fairer common ground to hold them accountable later on.
Could you imply some of these? So let's use this as an example. Can you can you apply processes to ensure that folks on the line or plant managers or whomever are asking the question, was the standard followed? So again, going back to your stop sign analogy, right? How do you establish more adherence to, hey, let's ask that question whenever something comes up that deviates from the process?
Sure. I think as we think about that countermeasure spectrum, downstream inspection is a very easy, tangible way of doing it, and it's relatively high on our countermeasure spectrum. It's right below air proofing. This would be an audit plan. This would come to, somebody checking, watching to make sure somebody is adhering to a standard, or making sure that just walking the floor and seeing how things are done, seeing if we're keeping the correct amount of material buffer um, between production lines, making sure that we are um, changing over when we're supposed to be, rather than doing longer production runs because it's easier and because we're going to get more material out of our machine. So that sort of stuff of really just engaging with the front line, it goes a very long way.
All right, I've got a question here. I, I think you might understand this better than I here, but why do people think that lean means none and run as on as needed, leaving holes throughout the supply chain?
Yeah, I think what this is meaning is something to do with inventory. And this has come up, I think last time we were on a call with this, it comes up a lot. The supply chain and lean have really been under scrutiny with all the supply chain disruptions that we've had post COVID,
Hmm.
mainly because folks don't understand lean or supply chain, and they're they're just kind of commenting and they found a good scapegoat. But often what people will say is, well, they're keeping inventory levels so low, and they're not really, understanding the ebbs and flows of demand. And I'm not exactly sure what this individual was asking, but really, lean is about creating stability, and it's creating, it's another foundational principle we didn't get to, but creating level scheduling. So the idea is not that we're going to run on nothing, bare bones, but it's that we're going to create stability and a level schedule. And I use the term smooth operation throughout our supply chain. And that affects the entire business. Toyota very much does not do a lot of big sales promotions in the way that other organizations do. And because of that, the reason they do that is because they want to keep a smooth operation through their supply chain. And big promotions means big sales spikes and then big sales dips. And that's something that they try to avoid. So I think in a lot of instances where you have holes in the supply chain, it's driven ultimately by sales organizations that are incentivizing large spikes and dips in customer behavior.
So why don't we close it out? This is a good time. Just want to thank again, Michael. Thank everybody here for joining us today. This is a series that I think we should continue the conversation on. Obviously, you see Michael's book here, The Lean Innovation Cycle. Please do check it out. We'll send you the link to the book in the follow-up with the slides in today's presentation. There's more lean practices and more discussion around optimization ahead of us. So please do check at your inboxes for those invites as we get those materials prepared. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Michael, you've been absolutely outstanding as usual. We'd love to have you back on.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks everyone for joining.
All right. You all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon on Beyond Compliance.